I'm Wilson Lai.
I'm Benjamin Yap.
I'm Eli Sands.
And you're listening to Deep Cut.
On Deep Cut, we compare a director's most popular film with a personal favorite chosen by one of us.
We also discuss that director's life and career to bring in context that helps us view their movies as they may want us to.
Oh, I think I was looking at the W sideways.
Yeah.
That's okay.
I was like, what's
okay.
going on?
That's okay. We improvise, and that's how we roll.
You can't spell improvise without improve.
Oh, true. Welcome to our second episode on Kiyoshi Kurosawa, in which we have decided to go big mode on this.
Big mode.
More than 4, which is the largest series we've ever done. So stay tuned to find out how many that is. The man has made, 20 films. Maybe we're doing all of them.
We could just turn into a Kiyoshi Kurosawa podcast.
Maybe we'll get more listeners that way. Talking about more listeners, if you're enjoying the show, please remember to give us a rating, a review if you're listening to this, and subscribe to us wherever you listen to podcasts. And you can keep up with us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and Letterboxd at Deep Cut Pod. And join our Discord server to chat about movies, TV, whatever you can think of. And you can find a link to that in the description. So for our second episode on Kiyoshi Kurosawa, moving on to the film right after Kyo that he has made. And we're kind of moving through these films chronologically. So we could do all of them. Who knows? And this is 1998's License to Live, starring Koji Yakusho. Is that correct? My God.
Yes, but Koji Yakusho is not our main character.
He isn't the main character, but he's one of the main characters. So he's the more well-known one at the time, starring alongside Hidetoshi Nishijima, who you might know from the more famous film recently, Drive My Car. And here he is as a little baby boy in front of one of his first few roles. He does not look the same.
I refuse to believe that is the same man. I refuse to believe. I've been staring at this man for 2 hours. I'm like, this is not this man. It cannot be.
This is what age does to a person, apparently. But then on the other side, you got Koji Yakusho, who looks exactly the same for the past 30 years. Man has looked 50 for 30 years.
Yes, he has.
So that's the duality of man. One person who just ages incomparably and one person who's just been old forever. But anyway,
Wow.
License to Live is the third film from Kiyoshi Kurosawa's filmography, or the fourth, since he pivoted away from his V-cinema stuff and his more like pink films.
/ softcore.
Yeah. And the story is about a boy who is 14 years old when he is run over by a car, and then he goes into coma. And 10 years later, he wakes up, but his whole family unit is no longer intact. And he kind of starts being taken care of by this character played by Koji Yakusho, who's like a family friend. And he tries to figure out his life after waking up 10 years in a coma. I mean, that's like the briefest summary of the movie, but like a lot is happening in this. There's like horses, there's milk,
There's slapstick.
There's fish.
there's fish. Yeah, there's one of those like you could make a no context spoiler images and it'd be like, what movie are we talking about? So maybe to begin, let's just do general reactions and then we can go from there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Ben, why'd you pick this one to spotlight?
I mean, I saw this very recently because of our series on Kurosawa, and I wanted to check out some of his other stuff. And the only other film from his filmography that's kind of more of a domestic drama / comedy is that I've seen is Tokyo Sonata, which is amazing. And I wanted to see Kurosawa, who we all know as kind of a genre filmmaker most of the time. I wanted to see what he was doing in this domestic space with more examples, more context, because I saw Tokyo Sonata and I was wondering how else he treated this kind of setting in a different movie, and was kind of exploring that. And I found something. I mean, Tokyo Sonata he also makes like 10 years after this. So this is a much earlier work as well. But of course, Cure is also an early work, which is also a masterpiece. So I was really curious to see where he went from Cure, because it's the film right after Cure that he makes. And yeah, that's why I decided to go with License to Live. And I was surprised by the ending, because I think it has this kind of slice of life quality to it, very episodic and kind of de-dramatized for most of the film. Like, it's pretty simple. It's not really plot heavy. And I was like, okay, this is pretty chill. And then he just goes insane with the ending. And I was like, what? And I found it very fascinating. And I just kind of want the both of you to experience what I experienced and talk about it. What do you guys think? Because you guys are about as fresh as me, but you guys have seen it more recently.
I am glad that I also did experience it. It's a really funny experience in different ways. I messaged you both when I was maybe 2/3 of the way through the movie and said, this movie is so funny. I'm laughing so much. And then that ending, which we'll talk all about, is not very funny. So I find myself thinking of a few different touchstones that helped me unlock this movie. The first is that I could not help but think of Takeshi Kitano because of how many jokes in this movie are made via the edit. An abrupt cut to a wildly different situation that requires you to piece together information of what happened in the ellipsis between two shots, which is always a funny experience. And also just people like walking into things and running into things and driving into things, falling down and getting beat up and beating things up. And it's a lot of slapstick in a very deadpan manner, which is very Kitano.
Yeah.
Now, where it differs is the second piece that helps me unlock it a bit, which is at first, I thought it was kind of a melodrama because there are a lot of things that happen randomly that put our main character into either really positive situations or very negative situations. For example, Fujimori, the character who's taking care of him, who's the family friend, his dad's old college friend, disappears from the second half of the movie for the most part, just all of a sudden because environmental agents are coming after him for industrial waste dumping. So that's a downturn. Then he reconnects with his family all of a sudden, and that's an upturn, and it keeps on going up and down in a very roller coastery way that felt like melodrama. The last thing that unlocks it is your review of it, Ben, from when you watched it. You wrote, quote, "Every scene is backed by a strong sense of the themes Kurosawa is interested in at large. His horror has been strong because they've been connected somehow to social or environmental ills, and here maybe the social dynamics are connected to some internal horror," end quote. So this just kind of got me thinking about the connections to Cure, right? We had a whole conversation in our last episode about the sociological bent of that movie. And I started thinking about the question of, if the main character, Yoshi's main question is if he can have a full self-determined life after having been robbed of 10 crucial developmental years and crucial kind of historical years in Japan and the world, to what extent is he responsible for that? And to what extent are the people around him responsible for that? Do we put blame for his entire situation on his fractured family, the irresponsibility of the adults around him, or is it up to him to make it all happen? And the ending, which is really harsh, just to spell it out, he is crushed by a pile of refrigerators that Fujimori has dumped on his property. Yeah, sorry, spoilers. That's something that seems totally random, and in fact, it's very surprising the way it's filmed. But really, there's a lot of culpability for that. I think you can trace a causal link back to Fujimori as well as Yoshi's family. So if it's a socially pointed drama, it is kind of masquerading as melodrama and as comedy. That's my sort of way into it.
Interesting.
But I also find it just flat out very funny through large passages of it. What about you, Wilson?
Yeah, I am still still reeling from that ending. We just got on the call, so I finished this movie maybe 20 minutes ago, and I watched the first hour and a half, and then remembered that Eli sent that message. It was really funny, and then Ben replied to that ha ha with a dead man emoji, and I was like, I knew
a skull emoji.
A skull emoji, yeah, a skull emoji. And I knew I had 30 minutes left, and I knew something really bad was gonna happen. But I didn't know that everything bad was gonna happen. So I think I'm still trying to like wrap my head around that ending and also just figure out how I feel about it. But I do think that Kurosawa's filmmaking is some of the most like nihilistic filmmaking on the planet. I think for whatever reason, whatever like reasons he has in making his cinema, I think it just makes you sort of think about like the worst case scenario. And I think what I see in this film is like, okay, this kid gets hit by this vehicle, gets into this coma, his family like dissolves in that time. He's not there to bear witness to it. He wakes up again, and then he starts like reconfiguring his life slowly, and we sort of see him slowly move pieces back together until they're almost like a complete whole. And then once again, but now he is there to witness it. He watches the fall of his family again, or the breaking apart of his family again, and then dies. And I'm like, well, when you see it like that, it's sort of super depressing. And he, like, his last words were like, did I really exist? And that could mean, was his whole life, did I really exist this whole life? Or was this chunk after he woke up from this coma till when he died, was he alive or was this a dream? And it's so sad to me. It's so sad. Like, despite how happy a lot of the film is and how funny it is, I think I come away from this film feeling like, I don't know, I was like so sad. It's just
Kurosawa, baby.
Yeah, we could get into it, but yeah, that's like even in his melodramas.
Should we begin at the ending? Before I get into how I think about the ending myself, I just want to drop in some context, which is a bit interesting, just kind of fun facts.
Sure.
Because I found this interview with Kurosawa when they were doing a bunch of double features with his films that he was programming with other films, all that are not his, with his films. You're going to pair features with his features. And he talked about how this film is very specifically inspired by this, I guess, Hollywood film. Not that old. It's maybe, I think the 60s or 70s. It's a Western by one of his favorites. Let me find this information.
Is it Peckinpah?
I think it's Peckinpah. Yes.
Fleischer.
Sam Peckinpah, which we name dropped last episode where he talked about his influences. Sam Peckinpah, Fleischer, and another guy whose name I can't remember.
Siegel and...
Don Siegel, right? So I think all of these filmmakers have all been influences in his work, and very specifically so. And so he name drops Ballad of Cable Hogue, which came out in 1970. It's a Western, but it's not like a gun shooting Western. It's a very simple kind of frontier Western about this man, Cable Hogue, who I think brings together a community of people in a Western town. And then I have not seen this film, but I think at the end, he kind of like decides to leave the town. But in the act of leaving, he dies. Yeah. So this is essentially the same basic structure of the film. Obviously, the twist of the coma and everything's very, very different. It's not a Western, but there's a dude ranch, which also I'm like, oh, no wonder there's a dude ranch. I was wondering why he wanted to do this horse thing, but yeah, but also it's a freaking beautiful horse. Like, gorgeous horse.
And the horse clearly seems to be an analog for Yoshi himself, right? There's all the talk of how this horse should be a pony, and Yoshi is effectively a 14-year-old kid inside a 24-year-old's body. He's penned up. He decides to leave in the end and needs to be dragged onto the truck, much in the way that Fujimori drags Yoshi throughout the movie.
Wow. I didn't even think about that. Then I realized milk bar is also kind of such a oxymoron. Because a bar is where you go get hammered, but you're there drinking milk, which is a baby drink.
You don't drink milk, Ben?
I didn't really think about that, but...
You gotta get calcium.
Not at the bar.
Yes, at the bar. Get a White Russian.
Milk wherever you go.
You always gotta have milk with you.
It's important for emergency situations.
Okay, teacher. Anyway, yeah, I mean, that's the only context I have in terms of the film. And it's interesting how he draws from this Western, which you would not think about. Reading this kind of interview with him, I realized that he's really a film professor. Like, he really, truly is a film professor.
Yeah.
He has all these references and like knowledge about old films that he's been pulling for all his films. And if I'm not wrong, Kyo also is inspired by some other old Hollywood film, which I'm slipping my mind right now, that's about where he said the inspiration was about how the killer is caught in the middle of that film. And the second half of the film is about the psychiatric assessment of the killer.
Oh, maybe like M.
Not M. It was also like a Hollywood film. Yeah. So also kind of interesting how he pulls.
This guy knows his deep cuts.
He knows his stuff, man. He really loves the underappreciated filmmakers, especially these kind of also workhorse filmmakers who aren't as famous now, but back then were churning out films. So I found it to be really interesting.
You know who this reminds me of? Another deep cut director, Todd Haynes.
Oh, yeah.
We love our academic directors here.
Yeah. We love when they are not talking out their ass and like actually know what they're talking about and like what specifically they're pulling from the films. Because it's not just like a vibe thing. He's like pulling something very specific from these films, maybe from a narrative structure standpoint or whatever.
The movie you're talking about, Ben, is The Boston Strangler by Richard Fleischer.
Yes. Yeah, that's the one that inspired Kyo. So anyway, should we talk about the ending? Or should we save it for later? Okay, let's go at the ending because that's where we're all talking about right now. What's interesting to me is both of you talk about more of the kind of the sudden horror of it. And like, of course, it was extremely surprising for me, but I watched it again shortly before we recorded and it makes me feel a lot of things, but I'm also feeling like there is a certain strange optimism to it, which I cannot explain.
Ooh.
Oh, I can try to maybe, which is that like when I talk about the internal horror in my review, I was trying to remember what I was talking about because it was very late in the night when I wrote that and I was just rambling. And I was thinking about the way that Nishijima portrays his character Yutaka, who is kind of like in a fugue state for some of the movie because he kind of wakes up kind of like a zombie. He doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know what to do with his life. And he's trying to pull his family back together. But he has these moments where he's just staring into space or like doing absolutely random things because he's not sure what to do. And then I was watching this scene where he's staring at his father look at the dude ranch in the middle of the night. And he's just like kind of broken. And then he hugs Fujimori.
Yeah.
And like he knows something is off with him. So there's kind of like this sense of loss, but he doesn't really blame anyone. Like he clearly does not blame the person that ran into him, causing his coma. Like he really doesn't care about the person that put him into this coma. But he is just kind of at a loss. And I think that's the internal horror that I was kind of referring to, that he doesn't ever tell anybody, but then the film kind of extracts from it. But the ending really pulls it together for me because when he asked, like, did I really exist? He just wanted to know if like he did anything with his life, in which almost half his life he was in a bed asleep, right? And of course, on paper, it's extremely bleak. Like you wake up from a 10-year coma, which is a friggin' miracle, and die like 6 months later or less, in a moment in which you see your life opening in front of you, right? Because he is in a moment of excitement about to leave the town with Fujimori.
Yeah.
And then he dies. And that's like crushing, literally and emotionally. But sorry. But the way that Nishijima like plays this out is with this smile on the boy's face. Like he's kind of in a daze, but he kind of is content with that short amount of time he had after waking up. And I found that to be an interesting choice. Like it is sad because we know it to be sad, but I think the performance tells us that for him, it's okay, right? And in fact, he even feels like he wished he had stayed in the coma for the rest of his life, which he expresses to the man that runs him over. So I just find it to be a very fascinating way of approaching this tragedy where it's not this absolute tragedy in that sense, but there is this sense of like, maybe this is enough. Maybe this is enough for our life. And I think that's quite a kind way of looking at it. Like, it's not seen as a waste necessarily for him. I found that to be very moving in a way that wasn't just completely depressing.
Yeah, I like that, Ben. There's something cyclical about it where Yoshi, when he is crushed by the refrigerators, he is just torn down his dude ranch. Fujimori, his closest thing to a father figure, has returned into his life. They're about to depart for anywhere else and take a next step. And he's bringing the part of it that matters most to him, the horse, with him.
Yeah.
That's sort of like a departure from adolescence. And he gets cut off right at the moment of leaving adolescence, which is an echo of him being 14, crucially an age when puberty and development is really starting. And it's a repetition. And that echo makes it into something like a cycle. Him asking, did I really exist? I agree with you, Ben. It's like, did I accomplish something here? And he did. He was able to create a version of what existed before, bring his family together mostly successfully. And this is the end of one cycle. And if it's a dream or if it's real is perhaps immaterial because it's another chance to start again. That very ending, the sort of coda with Fujimori finding the postcard from the lounge singer in his book about horses, very puzzling, but there's something weirdly optimistic about that too, where here's a slice of Yoshi's life that was private and his own, and he got to have it. Mm-hmm. And we know what it is, but Fujimori never will. There's something about not just bringing people together but also having his own private slice. Everyone is really only together for his funeral, ironically.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then like they show how everyone just kind of splits up after.
Yeah, but I think it was a beautiful thing where he was like, oh, did I really exist? Like, what did my life amount to? And then they cut to his funeral where we have that really long, wide tracking shot as they walk from the car and end up all staring at the dude ranch together. And I think he did accomplish it. And I think that was just Kurosawa's like statement on that, or like that full stop on that before everyone departed. That scene where he's asking in a very like tranquil way, did I really exist, reminds me of a scene earlier on in the film where I sort of feel like Yukata vocalizes his wish when his mom's there hanging clothes and she like asks for a pin or something and he's like sitting there and his eyes are closed and he's like, am I dreaming? I'm sort of paraphrasing here, but he was like, oh, my wish is for everyone in the family to be together again.
Just for a moment, he says.
Yes. And I think it is so beautiful. And even though I think he nearly achieves it. I think he basically does achieve it when they are all staring at the TV when the dad gets interviewed after they thought he was dead. I think that moment was the moment where they were together. But I thought it was hilarious that the sister muted the fucking TV. We're like, I'm not going to listen to my dad talk anymore.
Yeah, like I think if anything, he accomplished getting his family to be together for a little bit. And I mean, he doesn't really show you how they feel about this, but they get to have that. And in a sense, he came back to life to give them that. Because he is also this unit from their past when they were together. He comes back alive to give them a chance to be together again. And maybe there is no outcome for that. They're not going to stay together, but then, like, he lets them relive that for a moment. And he achieves that, which is like fascinating on a meta level. But like when you think about how you think about your own life, like that's really not something you always think about, right? When you think about your effect that you have on other people, you might not be able to see outside yourself. And I think the film is able to kind of make you feel like his life had value outside of just the stuff that he does.
I certainly feel that.
I want to talk about the coda, because like the coda, when you talked about it, I got goosebumps because I watched it again. I also got goosebumps. And it's a very simple kind of narrative thing where you plant something, because we don't see that postcard when it's placed in his book. During this random scene where he watches this woman he meets singing. And it's like this sweet moment, but it's not really like important.
And by the way, not a very good singer.
Anyway, she wants to go to New York, but it does not pass the New York's test.
Yeah, I mean, hey.
She won't make it in the Big Apple.
Eli just killed her dream, but anyway.
It's on purpose, right? That she's not a very good singer. It's supposed to be a funny scene, right?
I mean, she's just a person.
Well, now I sound like a jerk.
I thought she's fine. It's fine.
It didn't stick out to me how her singing was not good.
Well,
it was average at worst.
Okay, go on.
Damn, New York standards are high. Anyway, so it's a postcard of New York. Anyway, all I was going to say is that it really hits me because the freaking film ends on him picking up the postcard, turning over, seeing that it's blank, and it just cuts. And the fact that it's blank, I think, metaphorically feels like a big statement. like of a potential
Oh, okay. Of what could have been or what's to come.
of what can be. Because like exactly. It's an unused postcard. So in that sense, Yutaka is an unused postcard that he didn't really get to fill in the blanks yet. But I think it's kind of an interesting thing. It kind of twists the knife a little bit, but not in a way that's, I think for me, too depressing. But I kind of liked how I felt from that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think it's powerful in a cinematic way because it's just this simple thing of revealing a thing that you forgot about.
I was going to ask about that scene because I was like, well, because it was just stuck in my mind the whole film. I was like, what is that scene? Like, how is that related to anything else in this film? And then, boom, like, last fucking shot. There it is.
Yeah. You guys have more thoughts on this ending?
I think about it in the context of Fujimori's, I suppose, kind of arc overall. There are other movies like this where we have a character who remains pretty constant and changes the people around him, right? Like something like a Paddington or a Pee-wee. I think this is very similar to that. Or even Kitano's A Scene by the Sea, which I found myself thinking of a lot during this movie.
Yeah.
Similarly, character arrives into an existing, somewhat broken in some way community, pulls them closer together through his single-minded desire to accomplish a goal, and then disappears in the end, leaving people to do ... Fujimori, I think, has the most interesting ... in the end, because he's the one, arguably, who has changed the most across the picture. To start out, he has custody, it seems, over Yoshi, right? Because he has the father's land. He's sort of the steward of the land. He takes Yoshi in. He says, you've got to figure your own stuff out. Like, this is all up to you. He's the only one who's really saying, you've got to make some choices, not trying to sway him one way or the other, but supporting his goals, like buying the horse and helping him set up the ranch, providing him food and shelter. And whereas initially he's very resistant to taking care of Yoshi, he does those things and takes those actions and seems to warm up to Yoshi. In that moment when Yoshi is watching his father out by the empty ranch, Fujimori asks Yoshi, is this how you want it? Which he's the only one who's asking, what do you want? So Fujimori warms up, but ultimately there's a real indictment of fatherhood and different kinds of fatherhood in this movie, because Fujimori ultimately is the one who's kind of responsible for returning the junk to the land, and that's the junk that kills Yoshi. He also disappears through the majority of the second half of the narrative. So there's the father who is running to keep up with Yoshi, but ultimately incapable of being competent enough to be there for his son and doesn't want to be there for his son. That's Yoshi's actual father. There's the father who changes and does what he can to support Yoshi, but ultimately makes some crucial mistakes that wind up killing him, Fujimori. And then there's the peer, Kasaki, his sister Chizuru's boyfriend, who is kind of another male figure who fills the place of the father towards the end of the movie, but winds up taking the step that takes the sister away, which takes the mom away. It's sort of like the final thread that pulls apart towards the end. And then there's Murota-san, who is the man who hit Yoshi back in the day with his car and takes vengeance on Yoshi and projects onto him his anger. So I sort of want to ask, what is this movie doing with fatherhood? Like, why all these examples of fathers who are there in some ways and who are incapable of being there in other ways? Why all the fixation on fathers? Why do the sister and the mother fall into place in the family structure, but the fathers really don't cohere in the end?
Maybe I think less about fathers and I think more about, because they're all men who are very alone and like to be alone. Even the girlfriend's boyfriend is a person who's like talking about how he's a geek and like people all kind of ostracize him, I guess, probably because of the way he is and looks, which is not very abnormal. It's very typical.
He looks totally normal.
But you have Fujimori who is like this loner, and then you have the father who just doesn't like to be in Japan, apparently, like likes to travel for work.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are people who are very distinctly isolated on purpose, I think, of their own volition. And I think it's interesting that these are his mentors and like these are the people he has to look to figure out his life after living you could say the most possibly isolated version of that.
Yeah.
And so he's trying to figure out using these kind of mentor figures, like how to figure out his life. And so many of them end up leaving because they are also not people who would mentor somebody else either. And even Fujimori is not somebody who really wants to do that. Like he himself says that he doesn't like kids.
Yeah.
And he has no interest, I think, in being somebody's father figure at all. And so I think it's kind of this, they're all kind of maladjusted in terms of the way they fit into a social fabric, because there isn't really a social fabric. And so Yutaka is kind of this glue that brings everyone together. But once he is gone, the entire thing falls apart. Like these people would not hang out with each other at the Dude Ranch and run a bar together if not for him being that person.
And to that point of Yoshi being the only one who really even wants a social fabric to begin with, I'm thinking now of his high school buddies who, after the reunion that he stages, they hang out with him, they go around with him, and, you know, they break into the comic store and steal the manga, and then they're playing and having fun. Afterwards, they're sitting by an overpass at the point when Yoshi decides to go home, and he thanks them for spending time with him. Right after he leaves, they depart and part ways. They're not continuing to hang out. It's like, well, our task here is done. Bye. See ya. So he's really the only one who wants to be gathering people together. Here maybe is where Kurosawa is making his sociological argument again.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, it makes me think about Pulse a little bit.
Ooh, in a larger kind of way. Yeah.
A little foreshadowing, but I think if you think about Cure is also a little bit about people being isolated and the crazy shit they'll do.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And
Yes.
here it's like when people are isolated and like people don't want to hang out with each other. And maybe the idea that, okay, this man wakes up 10 years after he goes in a coma, he is somebody from the past. And now we've kind of, in the ensuing modernization, maybe he's making this dig at how people are starting to kind of close up. Because I think Japan, generally, we get the sense that Japan is very interested in the social fabric. They're very interested in what you do for the community. They have a very strong focus on the community. But of course, in modern times, not just Japan, but in general, across the world, we have become more isolated in general.
Yeah.
Even though we are supposedly more connected.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, Yutaka is already not a man in this time. And he doesn't understand it. And he's also not a man with the mind of a man. He's also a child. He has a child's mind. So like he can't fathom why it's so difficult to pull people together. And so I find it to be very fascinating kind of construction to kind of make this point. Because that's what I mean by like how the themes are threaded through. Like everything's really about this. But he's not really like bonking you over the head with the themes.
No, not at all.
Like Kurosawa was a very good writer because he hides a lot of things very well. And so you never feel like he's being pedantic or like he is kind of spoon-feeding you what he's trying to say. But you can start to feel it and kind of tease it out. And in that sense, they're very rewarding to watch because you have to kind of think about the film.
Yeah.
Which makes me want to talk about the plot.
And the films are always about something as well, which is really interesting. Yeah. But I thought that it was I totally get the thread of fathers or men, but I think this also applies to the women in his life, even though they are the willing participants in rebuilding this family. When we see them at the start, they are separate and they are alone. Like aside from Chizuko and her boyfriend, like they are like separate entities, and then they end up like they leave this film as separate entities as well. And I think this sort of like loneliness and this sort of idea of cyclical, like dust to dust, ashes to ashes type thing, it feel like that this sort of, I would call it social experiment of Yutaka waking up, bringing people together, and sort of it dissolving is just showing us that, I guess, without one piece, everything falls apart.
Yeah.
And I think it's crucial that, I think Yutaka realizes it's crucial to have community in order to like feel happy or feel accomplished or feel a part of this world, to feel like you have existed in this world. But everyone else in this film doesn't really see it that way. And even though he like needs father figures or mother figures or sibling figures in his life, and they benefit him, they like help him grow, I think ultimately it is Yutaka's own doing, which like he raises himself by bringing the people back together. Like it is of his own volition.
I like that a lot.
In a way, he figures out how to live in a very short amount of time.
He gives himself the license to live.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here's a question. I think one of the fundamental grammatical building blocks of this movie is that Kitano-like editing for humor style, where you have to put together meaning across two shots and the space between them. How does that tie into this thematic exploration? Like, why that technique for this movie, aside from it being funny and kind of joyous and puzzling?
I would think that it's something related to my idea about how Kurosawa loves showing characters doing like unexpected things. Like, I think that is probably like the aesthetic through line through the work, at least with his work with actors. So then I think just that split second of you as an audience being like, what the fuck is going on here? Like, especially with all those like dragging scenes. So it's like, Kojima, like you're dragging him violently across a frame. You're just like, wait, why is this happening? What's happening? And then in that moment, that like sort of weird space where you're sort of taken out, but trying to like scramble your way back into the film, I think that's a Kurosawa special.
I think the way that he describes the film for you and the way that he shows you the film is very interesting, because you're always kind of a little behind the film, which is an interesting place to be, because most films don't put you behind what is happening. Like, for example, one of those examples of the pulling is when he's like pulling Yutaka to go like sleep with somebody or something, like at a like an erotic massage place or something. And all you can tell is that there's a sign for it and you don't know what's happening. And then immediately it cuts to Yutaka finding Fujimori in a bar and then talking about the experience. And the movie is kind of always making you do catch up. Like, when he starts doing the do ranch, you have no idea he's doing the do ranch.
Right. Yeah.
It never like sets up that that's the goal. It just starts happening. You're like, oh, okay, what are we building? Why is this so important? And then suddenly people are in the space, and then suddenly all the families appearing. And so you never quite realize that that's the plan that he had, like the do ranch and then get my family to come hang out with me. And then when Fujimori disappears, he just kind of disappears and you don't really realize why he's disappeared. And then you find out much later why he has disappeared. And so constantly you're just kind of trying to figure out what is actually happening. So the plot is extremely oblique, which I think is interesting because I think the thematics are also very oblique. And so it feels very episodic, a very slice of life, but it's actually quite focused on what it's trying to achieve, but you just don't realize it.
Yeah.
And even the way in which characters are introduced, you never really know who they are, sometimes until much later.
Yeah.
Fujimori, you don't know who he is at first. The father, the sister. You know, I like what both of you are saying. Wilson, this phrase that you're pushed out of the movie and scrambling to get back in, and then the idea that you're behind the action, it feels like you have to work to form a connection to the events and the people on screen, which does feel like it mirrors Yutaka's experience too. He's been pushed out of life and he's fighting his way back in. It takes work.
Yeah.
So maybe there's something parallels his experience in the audiences too, because of those editing choices.
Yeah. I mean, you can really feel, like, even though it's a domestic film, the kind of MO that he has to portray the story is not that far off from Cure, which is such a different movie. Because in Cure as well, you have this feeling like you're behind the movie.
Yeah.
And it doesn't explain what it's showing to you before it shows it to you. It's just like, here's the thing. And you're like, what is the thing?
Right.
Yeah. Right. Like in Cure, the first introduction to the killer on the beach, you're like, what the fuck is this?
Yeah.
So I find it to be quite fascinating because I'm trying to think of what other filmmakers are so brazen in just like throwing you into the deep end randomly throughout the film. Right? Just introducing new stuff and then like new characters and with zero setup or like explanation, just into the thick of it. We'll figure it out in 5 minutes.
Well, not to be too Eli pilled, but it does remind me of not just Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, but actually a lot of Le Carré adaptations. It is sort of a thriller mystery technique to show you the thing and let you almost forget about it and only later on learn why that part was shown to you.
Right.
Even in the dialogue in this movie, I'm thinking about how at one point in Fujimori's carp pool, it shows a couple of his regular customers fishing, and one catches a carp and says, "It's dead." And Fujimori says, "I think it's alive." There's like a little something to that, right? A little thematically relevant something.
Yeah, I feel that.
Right.
It's fascinating that he draws from such like genre influences, but then he makes this, and you don't think that it's influenced by those genres. But then when you really peel back the layers, then you're like, oh yeah, I kind of do see it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's an interesting application of those kind of lessons from genre films to something that doesn't seem like it is a genre film at all.
Yeah.
I feel like you could also see a link to, I think maybe it is like sort of like genre cinema that's sort of been like digested through multiple generations. But I think you can sort of do this sort of mind working thing with a lot of modern international auteurs. I'm thinking about like Ho Xiaoshen, like a lot of people who work in a lot of episodic kind of ways, like Yang in some ways.
Even Sasako, right?
Yeah, Sisako as well. Like you do a lot of work trying to piece together what happened in between scenes. And I guess Kurosawa, it works in even in a cut by cut kind of level. But I think this sort of, we've had the genre picks, we've had like the easily digestible stuff. So I think now, as I guess more matured or more developed watchers of film, I think we as audiences are able to work with this kind of work. And I think through the piecing together, like the work that you have to do, it sort of is more rewarding because it feels like you are coming up with the conclusions yourself more rather than it being handed to you, which is like, I guess, more classic Hollywood.
And feels very satisfying too.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love how you brought up Kitano and A Scene at the Sea, because I think this also reminded me a lot of Kitano, now that you talk about it, but not just because of, I guess, that tone and the relationships, but also the way that Kiyoshi Kurosawa in this film utilizes silence and how powerful and effective and meaningful, like how you can sort of draw meaning from like scenes with a lot of silence or just silent moments. And I think that's something that Kitano that's his bread and butter. Like he's just like a movement cut silence kind of guy. Like he can just tell a story through that. But I think with this, it is really interesting because I think it's not as laid out as it is with a lot of Kitano films where you're like sort of understanding the intentions of a lot of different things. But this, I think, with a lot of the silent actions or the silent scenes, you really have to piece together, like in some cases, like what is the relationship between him and this person, because they're not talking about the relationship, or what does Yutaka want to do in this scene? Like, why is he doing this? So I think that is like a testament to, I guess, the directing and also how strong that performance is in that weird balancing act of like keeping you engaged and following the track of the film, but also keeping you on your toes, because I think that is also an intention of Kurosawa. And I think the lack of dialogue sort of adds on to that.
Agreed. Yeah.
I think it's kind of good because like I think sometimes with like this kind of episodic art house stuff, it can be very like here and then this and then this and then this. It's very linear in that sense in terms of time. And yes, this is also linear in terms of time, but there's a lot of skips. And the skips kind of keep you kind of on your toes, as you said, and keep you engaged because it's never so literal in the way that he is displaying the plot. He kind of only shows you what is important so you can figure it out and then like makes it interesting and then throws in a bunch of jokes. I want to talk about comedy. I just want to ask what you guys thought was the funniest part of the movie. I mean, hands down for me, the place that I laughed the most, and I think the first time I really like laughed was when the dad runs into the freaking post.
Oh man, that's just classic.
And I was just like, what? It was absolutely random and completely stupid. I was like, okay, I guess this is the kind of movie this is right now.
Yeah, the timing of that is fantastic.
It's so perfect. Yeah, really the timing of all the slapstick is so good. Everything from Fujimori beating up the dad and knocking him into the pool twice in a row to when Fujimori is teaching Yoshi to drive the truck and you're just far away from it watching him slowly but surely drive the truck into a pile of junk and boxes, to especially when the lounge singer takes her scooter and just slowly drives down the alley into a pile of boxes.
Oh, yeah.
She's totally fine, but it's just happens so slowly and inevitably. It's great.
So many of the gags, I guess, happen in those longer takes. And it's just like, inevitable thing. And it's like kind of deadpan and it's just kind of, oh, okay, this is a thing right now.
Yeah.
I really like when Fujimori's smacking Yutaka's dad in that pond.
So good.
It's so good. And the details in that scene are great. Like, it's so smart that they put shit in the box and it's just flying out as he's smacking him. And then final just like releasing the net to hit him. It's just like, okay, this is
Yes, the net is so great. It's so well timed.
cherry on top. Yeah. And like, it's really like physical comedy, you know, like you have this guy falling into a pond and it's all happening for real, right?
I love the scooter. The scooter one is so funny. I think it's just seeing her like sort of... It's so big in frame. It's just like a massive pile of cardboard boxes. And it was so great that after that, like after he helped her fix it, he also started riding the scooter with no explanation. So I'm like, did she give it to him or did he get his own? Like, how did this end up happening?
I was thinking about like, why? Like, I was like, because you know, e-scooters are a big thing now. This was like 15 years ago. I was like, no, like 26 years ago, sorry.
Yeah.
I was like, wait, we had e-scooters then. This thing's like powered by gas. I was looking at it. It's like a little like petrol tank, I think, or like a diesel tank, I think.
Oh my God.
I was like, what?
Yeah.
And it's like not going very fast.
Yeah, it was so hilarious the first time he sees it because I'm sure Kurosawa was like, oh, let's just show, let's make a gag. Let's make a funny thing about like how much time has changed since he's like last been like alive or present on Earth. And it's like now we have e-scooters, but like back then they probably didn't know what the fuck were e-scooters, but watching it now. Like,
also, thinking about the boxes, like, you know, there's that scene really early on where he's like, Yutaka is just stamping the shit out of the boxes. Like, why? What's up, dude? I was like, what is up with this dude?
Yeah.
He's just like raging on the boxes and then they come back much bigger and more.
Yeah. It's actually, this whole movie is actually him versus junk.
Yeah, it's true. And I mean, the way that his death is played out is kind of in a very similar way to how the comedy is played out.
Yeah.
What are refrigerators if not big boxes?
Yeah.
True. Wait, why did he beat up this guy in the arcade? Does anyone...
I don't know.
I'm like confused about that bit. I'm like, what is that?
That's the thing about his characters, because he doesn't tell you he doesn't tell you what's going on in his head. He's going through a lot of shit and he's stressed. But he's taking it on things that don't make sense. But I think he's not really blaming the people that you think he would blame. He's just kind of has this internal rage that he's trying to like get out, which is interesting. Yeah, I'm trying to think of other comic moments. But I think the other thing about the way that he shoots the comedy is that I think about the way he shoots in general. And once again, I don't think it's very far off from how he shoots Cure from a year ago.
Yeah.
But what I really like is that the way he frames space is very real. Like the places you're in, like he never really, maybe shows you the whole layout or whatever. But everywhere that he shoots, he feels like you shoot it in a way that makes sense as like how people would use the space. You never feel like he's cheating because he shows you so much of the space. And the thing that kind of I think about is when he's having a conversation in the kitchen or something, and then somebody's like moving stuff outside the window. And I can't remember who's doing what, but it's a very small thing where I think
he's having a talk with his sister, and then the boyfriend and Koji Yakusho are outside. Yeah.
and they're moving stuff around. Really like stuff like that because then you feel like the world is bigger than the frame, which I think he does a lot of. Like when he's moving the camera around or panning the camera around, it really makes the spaces feel like real places. And there's that kind of, I would call it kind of a realist approach to how you show things, but kind of in not such a boring way, I would say, where things feel real and the action feels like it makes sense in the context of the space, like the literal space that you're in.
That distinction between foreground and background especially is there from the very start when Yutaka wakes up from his coma in the background of the shot where the nurse is doing other work, and it takes her a while to notice him. And then when the doctor is interviewing him, initially they're side by side, but the doctor comes to the front of the frame to continue his conversation while Yutaka's stuck in the background. He works his way up to the foreground.
I was just thinking about that gag where he falls off the bed and she doesn't notice him, and it takes her a hot second. There's so many funny things that happen in the hospital, like the recreation of the very first shot where you think he's like in the stretcher that's being rolled down the hallway, but he's actually just, he walks past the stretcher that's being rolled down the hallway. That's a really good one.
You know what I love is on the topic of jokes that are built in through just sudden cuts, his relationship with Murota, the man who hit him with a car when he was 14, is very strained, needless to say. And Murota kind of winds up prompting him to tear down his own dude ranch in the end. The first interaction with Murota is him pushing Yoshi down the hall in a chair, and they're like having fun. We see this from a distance. They're running down the hall, playing together essentially, like the 14-year-olds that Yoshi kind of is. And then they go into their serious conversation outside. But there are just those little edits that give you glimpses of something more than the sustained scenes, suggestions of things that we don't quite grasp.
I mean, I don't really have much else to talk about this movie.
Me too.
Guys?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I just feel like you can never, I don't think I can ever leave watching a Kurosawa film and being like, okay, that's that's done and done. Great, good film. I'm always just thinking about it. I'm trying to open it up, piece it together in my own kind of way, and what it means for me or what it means for what Kurosawa wants to say about society. There's always an invitation to dig deeper, no matter what genre he's trying to play or what subject matter it is. It's so great. It's like a puzzle box film. And I think we can always go into Hamaguchi when we have time to go into Hamaguchi. Yeah. But Ben just saw Evil Does Not Exist. And I was talking about how that film feels very Kurosawa-esque in the way that things work and the way that the ending happens. It feels very much like that. So I'm glad that students of Kurosawa, literal students of Kurosawa, are sort of propagating that kind of work that gets us to think about the movies that he makes. Because if you think about the movie, you're also thinking about the world around you. I believe that, because I think every movie is someone trying to say something about the world. But I think just the way that these filmmakers go about this is so great, and I'm so glad we're taking the time to dive into Kurosawa's work.
Perfectly said.
The man knows how to end a movie, which is a very important skill.
Yes.
I think that's the thing. I think some films can whiff the ending, but I think almost has an idea of how his films will end before he, much earlier than other people do. He's always working towards an ending that will seal the deal. And I think that's why I don't think he's had a bad ending.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Of all the films I've seen. So I think he just knows how to work towards a goal.
I'm glad we're doing this in chronological order because this was a really interesting detour that wound up being very relevant. This is not one of his strictly genre pictures, but next episode we're pivoting back to genre with Pulse, supernatural, horror. Let's go. One of my favorite movies. I'm very excited for this.
I really want to hear what you think about that movie, actually, because I don't think we've really we've discussed this thoroughly, and I'm curious what you think about it.
I'm excited to rewatch. Rewatching Cure really opened it up for me, and I already love Pulse, so I'm excited to revisit.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was my first ever Kurosawa that I saw, so I'm very, very excited to come back to it.
I'm honestly very intrigued by his other more domestic films. I hear Bright Future is really good. So that's currently on my list. It's comes out after Pulse. So I don't know, maybe this list will just get longer and longer.
Slowly turning into blank check.
Kiyoshi podcast only. The good thing is this guy has too many films.
I think Kurosawa deserves it.
He's a little undersung, I think.
Well, I think a lot of our directors deserve it, but yeah.
I'm realizing he could become one of my guys by the end of this miniseries.
Oh, that's awesome. I didn't really realize, I think when I started watching Kurosawa, that I would find him to be so interesting. But then the more I watch, it really builds the way that he has this very singular way of approaching filmmaking and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Deep Cut. Please rate and review because that helps us keep making the show and helps others discover the show as well. Be sure to subscribe to us wherever you listen to podcasts so you'll know when our next episode drops. You can keep up with Deep Cut on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and Letterboxd at Deep Cut Pod, and join us to talk about movies on our Discord server. We now also have a Patreon. If you want to support us, we deeply appreciate it. You can find a link to the Patreon and the Discord in the description. Deep Cut is hosted and produced by us, Wilson Lai, Benjamin Yap, and Eli Sands. This episode was edited by Buchar, and our cover art is designed by Justina Yam. And our theme song is composed by Eli Sands.
I'm Wilson.
I'm Ben.
I'm Eli.
Take care, and we're looking forward to talking about more movies with you next time.